I want to talk to you about one of the most often repeated and most misunderstood phrases ever in the history of design of any kind. Form follows function. You may have heard this, and you may not have, but this is a common refrain, and a lot of times, quite frankly, we hear it from people on the engineering and programming and development sides of the equation, because this is taught largely still in engineering school, in development programs, in programming courses. I still hear it all the time. But the fact of the matter is, it's a poor interpretation of something that was said many, many, many years ago. And like a lot of things, once it gets handed down, it gets corrupted. On the surface, form follows function seems to make a lot of sense, okay? Which means the way that something looks should be determined by its purpose. But that's an oversimplification. In terms of UI design, it typically gets applied like this. We gather, that word's in quotes for a reason, the product's requirements from the client. Okay? In other words, they tell us what the requirements are supposed to be. They give us a big laundry list and we go do it. We gather them like we're picking stuff off trees, which is a very poor approach to do anything. But that's another argument for another time. So we gather the product's requirements and then we determine the aesthetics of the UI based on those functional requirements. Here's what the system has to do, and here's what the visual should look like based on that functionality. It's treated like a one-to-one relationship. It's not that simple. It's not that simple because in my experience, this approach delivers products that fail. They're not purchased, they're not used, and they don't deliver a shred of ROI to the company that created them. Why? Why does that happen? Well, because form follows function has been co-opted to mean something it doesn't. It's been bent to serve people's individual goals and needs and aspirations. It's been misinterpreted to mean something that it absolutely does not, as you will see, and it's been misapplied. Okay, the way that it gets applied in products results in things that are very hard to use for human beings. So this is a lot like if you ever heard of the game of telephone. All right, we played this when we were kids. I don't know if kids still do this, but we used to. The deal is one person starts. Okay, person number one in this little illustration here says something to person number two. Person number two then says it to person number three. Person number three passes it down the line to person number four. The deal is by the time it gets to person number six, the phrase usually changes. And it's not what the original person said anymore. That's what's happened with the phrase form follows function. So in order to understand how to properly apply this principle, because there is a relationship between form and function, absolutely, but you need to understand how this came to be, because I also want you to know how it came to be so very terribly misinterpreted. Louis Sullivan started all this in 1896. He was an architect. This is an intense human being. He laid down this edict, right? And you can almost hear someone saying this or typing it in all caps, right? It is the pervading law of all things organic and inorganic, of all things physical and metaphysical, of all things human and all things superhuman, of all true manifestations of the head, of the heart, of the soul, that the life is recognizable in its expression, that form ever follows function. This is the law. Intense guy. All right. And this is kind of how he laid down this edict in this very strong, powerful way. All right. And here's what happened to that. Sullivan was essentially a rebel. Okay. At the time, technology, tastes, economics, everything was changing. The world was in flux at that time. And the forms of late 19th century buildings were still based on the ancient Greek and Roman architectures. So what was happening is there was a backlash against that, all right, against tradition. And we've seen this all throughout history, all right? You guys are seeing it now with mobile apps versus desktop apps, right? We're like, hey, that's old. It's done. It's over. Everything's got to be responsive. Everything's got to be mobile, et cetera, et cetera. The same kind of thing was happening then. Sullivan believed that a new form for buildings was needed, one that was derived from the function of the building instead of historical precedent. He was saying, look, why are we following all these traditions? We should be basing our design on the function of what it is that we're designing, which, hey, in theory, makes all the sense in the world. And the new forms that he was talking about are essentially what became the modern structural steel skyscraper, right? When you're in New York City or LA or Chicago, or all across the globe, actually, you see these incredible, towering modern structures. That's where a lot of this came from. Enter the intern, Frank Lloyd Wright, who I'm sure is a name that most of you know. Wright was an intern for Louis Sullivan, and his thing, what he came to believe, was that form and function should be one, joined in a spiritual union. Wright took Sullivan's idea and evolved it. Okay, he was stressing the need for integration between form and function. His application of that principle was the Guggenheim Museum, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. The spiral shape of the building was intended to allow visitors to easily view the artwork inside, which is why it looks like this. That's why the interior looks like this. As you walk, you move through the museum and you're following one single simple path, and everywhere you go, you are seeing the art without having to go through a maze or venture off the path. To this day, it's a brilliant example of good design. Wright understood context of use. How do people interact with art in a museum? What is the best way to eliminate all other distractions, right, of trying to find your way or trying to figure out where you are or trying to see things? What if you could just walk and see things as you move? No effort. All right, that's good design. So Frank Lloyd Wright started us down the right path. Extremists, however, as I'm sure you know, always find a way to take us off the path. So there was a ripple effect of this. In 1908, an Austrian architect named Adolf Loos proclaimed that architectural ornament was a crime. A crime, by the way. This was a reaction to the extreme ornamentation of the time. So he was against anything that was, visually pleasing. He just thought it was frivolous, okay, silly. More modern architects like Le Corbusier, Walter Gropius, Miles van der Rohe adopted both ornamentation as a crime and form follows function as moral principles. And what these guys did is they applied it to design. Here's where this starts to creep into visual design. This is the important part. Modernism in architecture emerged from both those principles. The goal was to determine the form of a building solely from functional requirements, not traditional aesthetics. Then a guy named Walt Gropius founded a little club called the Bauhaus, which I'm sure some of you heard of. His whole thing was architecture begins where the engineering ends. Think about this for a second. What he was essentially saying is that design begins where the engineering ends, and that engineers can only do so much. Okay, their job is very specific. It's to the underlying structure. It's smart. It is smart design. It's smart planning. But there's a whole other component of this. This is huge in relation to your understanding of design and how it should work. The Bauhaus was a school of multidisciplinary design. Industrial design, art, typography, graphic design, photography, architecture, they touched it all. Form, in their eyes, had to reflect the function of the product. Communication and meaning should never be sacrificed in favor of visual design choices. Meaning design, not decoration. Where have you heard that before? Artistic devices, in their opinion, were used only to increase the utility of the work. If that doesn't sound like the modern definition of user interface design for digital technological products, I don't know what does. So Bauhaus, in turn, was the foundation for modern graphic design, right? The connections between color and shape, the principles that you're going to hear about in this course, were started by men like Paul Klee, Vasily Kandinsky. Clean, powerful typography, Herbert Bayer, was the man who introduced these concepts. Spatial relationships, integration of shape, color, and typography, putting everything together. Moholy Nagy was the driving force behind that. The core principles of visual design that we're going to talk about, like harmony, balance, rhythm, proportion, symmetry, synthesis. Joseph Albers of the Bauhaus pioneered all this. What I'm trying to get across to you is that the principles that you need to understand and be able to apply in an interface come directly from this source. Modern graphic design is the foundation of UI design. And if you do not own the book on the left, Universal Principles of Design, I strongly suggest you pause this video and go get it right now. It is absolutely indispensable. There is no principle in this book that has ever not been true in the history of the world. So it is a worthy addition to your library, and I strongly suggest you pick it up. As recently as Microsoft's radical change in interface design that you see here on the screen, these principles are behind all of it. Now, that was certainly a flawed implementation and execution, all right? But I applaud the effort because they were starting to think very hard about how people use things and the impact of mobile devices on desktop use, right? Once we get used to different paradigms, our expectations of how things work change. That's Microsoft trying to say, okay, how do we reinvent this? How do we reimagine this? And they did so, believe it or not, going back to a lot of these foundational principles. So UI design mantra number 3 is form does not and should not follow function. The two have to work together. Remember what Wright said, a spiritual union as one. As high-minded as that sounds, it's absolutely the truth. The two things affect each other. One does not trump the other. They have to work together. And when they don't, people have a hard time using things.